All right, this is the Politics and Citizenship Review, Part 5. Okay, World War II then. Civil liberty violations during World War II would include Japanese internment, when basically every single right was taken away from them. In addition to that, they also lost their personal property and possessions. And that, of course, happens with Executive Order 9066 that set up the internment camps. All right, but you also see certain times where you see some expansion of rights with the executive order that said you cannot discriminate in defense industries when hiring and things like that. So you do see both sides.
What if it was from Jack?
Yeah, 8022. I think it was that one. All right, now into the 1960s and 1970s, we're also going to have a period of the growth of government again. And that's going to come with Johnson and the Great Society. All right, we just talked about Kennedy today and how most of his New Frontier doesn't pass. Well, it passes under Johnson. Some of the things that expanded the government under the Great Society, I'm just going to go through these because we haven't covered it yet. Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is health care for the elderly. Medicaid is health care for low-income Americans. So Medicare and Medicaid. All right, guys, again, there are too many people chit-chatting, so be quiet. You're being rude. Okay, Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Elementary and Secondary Education Act is going to give a lot of money, a lot of federal money to education.
What was that called?
The Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Also included are the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which obviously gave the federal government more power to control ending segregation and voting rights. Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we have talked about those. Also, Immigration Act of 1965, which we talked about on the Demographic Review. Those are all things that are part of the Great Society. In addition to that, there were tons of other things. Federally funded public housing is another one. So we'll go through some more of those tomorrow. But all of them do the same thing the Progressive Era did, the New Deal did. It expands the power and the reach of the federal government. Second thing has to do with foreign policy, and that's the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This is in 1964, and this is really what starts our combat in Vietnam. What it did is Congress, in this resolution, gave the president unlimited power to wage war in Vietnam. Congress gave the president unlimited power to wage war in Vietnam. So again, expanding the power of the presidency to wage war without a declaration. And we'll look at that very closely when we look at Vietnam tomorrow or Wednesday. All right, now, getting back into civil liberties and the push of people to make changes to government laws. We have the student movement. And again, we're looking at this when we talk about Vietnam. This was in response to the Vietnam War. The organization that leads the student movement is SDS, which stands for Students for a Democratic Society. Students for a Democratic Society. And it's basically to give students more of a voice. Okay? Their statement of purpose was called the Port Huron Statement. Port Huron Statement. Now, the student movement actually began as a free speech movement where on the University of California, Berkeley campus and many other campuses, students were not being allowed to hand out flyers about civil rights. They were participating in the civil rights movement. They were not allowed to hand out flyers about this movement. So they start by protesting for their freedom of speech. And once they have success doing that, and they see that they can have power through peaceful civil disobedience, then they begin to protest the Vietnam War. The student movement to protest the Vietnam War will link up with what we call the counterculture or the hippies. So the students and the counterculture are different groups, and we'll talk about that. But they come together to protest the Vietnam War. And some of the protests will get violent. They do a lot of marches, even when they don't get the permission to march. Another big protest of the student movement was at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where they protested the Democratic candidate for president to show their displeasure with the Vietnam War. And probably the biggest thing is going to be May of 1970 with the Kent State protests, where 4 student protesters will be shot. All right, the counterculture, as I said, is more of the hippies. They also will protest the war, but they kind of take away the legitimacy of the student movement. The counterculture will be big into drugs and music, and they'll really, their goal was they did not think democracy worked, and so their goal was just like live in their own separate world. They did not think it was possible to fix America. So when they protested, they weren't protesting because they wanted to make things better. They just wanted to make as much havoc as they possibly could.
Have there ever been an essay on like New England and like the colonies?
Mm-hmm. All right, lastly then, other key protest movements. And notice women and civil rights, as far as African Americans go, are not in here because they're on the diversity review. So this is basically reviewing what we did today. I'll go as quickly as possible. The Latino or the Hispanic movement, what was their goal? Improve conditions for who? Migrant farmers. Under strategies, what was their key organization or leader? Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. And what was the big strategy they used? Anybody remember from today?
They boycotted grapes.
Very good. They boycotted grapes and lettuce. And the outcome is they did see better conditions for migrant workers. The Japanese Americans, what were their goals? Huh?
Was it to get an apology?
Very good. Get an apology and compensation for internment. And the outcome is they really won't get that until 1988. Native Americans, what were some of their goals? Matt? Very good. Get land or compensation for land that was taken from them. What's another goal that they had?
Preserve their culture.
Yeah, preserve their culture. And greater self-determination on their reservations. What was the key organization for them? AIM, yes. American Indian Movement. And what were some of their strategies? Took over Alcatraz. The Broken Treaties Caravan. And you also have the violence of the Second Wounded Knee between AIM leaders and the FBI. The outcome is they do get greater autonomy on reservations, and they do begin winning or at least settling in court for compensation for lands that were taken from them. Now, before you move, I want you to add a little something to the bottom there. What we're going to see in the 1970s and 1980s is the rise of conservatism, which is basically kind of a backlash against what we see in the Great Society, the New Deal, the Progressive Era. So you know how after the Progressive Era we went into the 1920s where we had a lot of conservatism, okay? After the New Deal, we do kind of go into a little bit of a conservative era in the 1950s. The 1970s and 1980s, you're going to see people want to deregulate, lessen the government restrictions, and you're going to see a backlash to a lot of these protest movements, okay?